as I start. I will now hand over to Carole Martinez, our coordinator at the Scottish Women's Budget Group. So we're an organisation that promotes equality using gender budgeting and economic decision making to build fairer and more equal Scotland. Carmen coordinates all Scottish Women's Budget Group activities, including policy and projects with partners. Prior to this, Carmen spent a year in Brussels working with Horizon Europe funds and the LIFE programme in support of the European Green Deal. Over to you, Carmen.
Thank you, Eve. So welcome everyone. My name is Carole Martinez, and my presentation will focus on the findings of our childcare survey, which was launched in mid-August. And as such, I will highlight some of the problems with the childcare system in Scotland, and I will be looking at these from the perspective of women. Next slide, please. In terms of the structure of this presentation, I will first dedicate a few slides to introducing the Scottish Women's Budget Group to those in the call today who may not have heard of us before. Next, I will delve into the childcare survey results, and finally, I will touch on the recommendations that we made on the Scottish Government to the Scottish Government and local authorities to make the childcare system work for women in Scotland. Next slide, please. So, about us, the Scottish Women's Budget Group was created over 20 years ago and was operating as an entirely voluntary group until its incorporation as a SKIO in 2020. The group brings together a wide range of women from across Scotland who have an interest in women's equality and want to achieve better gender equality in our society. And we particularly focus on the way decisions are made about how money is spent or collected, so that it takes into account the different perspectives of women and men. So because of this, we spend a lot of time thinking and asking ourselves questions in relation to the impact that spending decisions have on women, or thinking about whether the Scottish Government allocates enough resources to meeting its commitments on gender equality, or about whether freezing council tax rates is the best decision to tackle the impact of the cost of living crisis on women, when we know, and women in this call will know, that ill-funded local authorities have had to make cuts to after-school clubs, for example. Next slide, please. So we gather evidence and conduct policy analysis, an example of which would be the childcare survey. We work with some local authorities to embed gender budgeting principles into their decision-making processes, and we also support local women's groups with campaigning efforts. For example, we've been working with the Glasgow Disability Alliance and with the Foresight Women and Girls, exploring the impact of the cost of living for different groups of women. You can see some of these work, the publications in our website. But what all our activities have in common is that they aim to build a gender equal economy. Next slide, please, Eve. And what do we mean by this gender equal economy? Well, a key element of a gender equal economy is care. So recognizing the role that care plays in our society and the need for this to be valued and invested in. By the way, this is one of the reasons why we are involved in the Scotland That Cares campaign.
Oh, really good. Very useful. Thank you.
I think if some people could mute, yes, thank you so much. I was saying that because of all this focus on care, this is one of the reasons why we are involved in the Scotland That Cares campaign, and we'll leave the link in the chat shortly. But back to the slide, there is a quote, which is taken from the quote from the book, Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner? And the quote reads, "Economists often joke that if a man marries his housekeeper, the GDP of the country declines. If, on the other hand, he sends his mother to a care home, it increases again." The joke says a lot about the perception of gender roles among economists, but also shows how work done within the home is not counted as part of GDP. But the same work done outside of it is. But even despite the role that care could play in increasing GDP, we know that care infrastructure does not always receive the right amount of funding, which has implications for women and gender equality. And this leads me now to speak about childcare. So next survey, please, Eve. Our Women's Survey 2023, which we launched at the beginning of the year, provided some evidence in relation to the impact that childcare costs were having on women amidst the cost of living crisis. Particularly, we noted that the 30 hours funded early learning and childcare was not working for women on low incomes, given the lack of flexibility of childcare provision. For example, women working on retail or hospitality who have to do shift work told us that they were not able to access these funded hours to cover evening childcare, for example. So in light of this, we decided to run a dedicated childcare survey, which we launched on 15th of August. And this coincided with the beginning of the new school term in some local authorities in Scotland, or in most of them, and was available for over 3 weeks. The main purpose was to understand whether the current funding offer is working for women or not, and also whether the cost of living crisis is having an impact on women's ability to manage childcare costs. 216 women responded to the survey, and one of the first things that we noted was that from a socioeconomic and socio-demographic perspective, the majority of respondents, so 66%, had a household income of over 50,000 per year, and 13% of over 100,000. And most respondents to previous surveys were under the 30,000 household income category. Sorry, I just checking that everyone is on mute. Thank you. Yeah, I was saying that the most respondents to previous surveys were under the 30,000 household income category. So this was a change. But leaving this aside, the main issues that came up in the survey related to affordability of childcare, availability, the 30-hour funding, and the impacts that all of these is having on women. So we go over each one of these in more detail now. Next slide, please. So in terms of affordability, 54% of women told us that they had to make changes to other areas of household spending to manage childcare costs. 30% were struggling to manage childcare costs. 74% agreed that increases in other household costs, such as electricity, rent, and food, had impacted their ability to manage childcare expenses. And then issues in relation to affordability that came up in the survey relate to fees, nursery fees for 1 and 2 years old, and the extra costs linked to private childcare provision, even when there is funding in place. And I will touch on that in a moment. Next slide, please. In terms of accessibility, 38% of women found accessing childcare difficult during term time, and 22% found it very difficult. These figures do not change much for summer holidays, with 37% of women again saying that they find accessing childcare difficult, and 24% found it very difficult. And accessing childcare in rural areas may pose another challenge, with mothers having to travel, for example, which impacts on time that they could dedicate to paid work. The availability of childcare provision for children with additional support needs is another key finding that came up in the survey. 50% of respondents had a disabled child. This increased to 24% for single parents and 31% for disabled women. These respondents told us that the lack of suitable after-school and holiday clubs told us about these issues, the lack of suitable after-school and holiday clubs, and how this affects the work that they can do. And another issue raised was the extra costs that parents need to cover when a child has additional needs or a health condition. So, for example, a mother told us about how all her disposable income is going on food to cater for her son's restricted diet. And again, considering the cost of living crisis, this leaves parents or people, and this mother in particular, in a very precarious position. Next slide, please. So in terms of the 30 hours funding, 44% of respondents qualified for this as their children met the age criteria. However, 16% were unable to access these hours due to the lack of flexibility in provision. 14% noted that the 30 hours funding meets their needs, 72% stated that it partly meets their needs, and 14% said that it didn't meet their needs. And for women living in rural areas, 39% noted that this funding does not meet their needs. So again, it talks about that urban-rural divide. The quote on screen references the extra costs that I was talking about, the private nurseries add to make up for the shortage of funding. Other responses, however, drew attention to the school nursery being less flexible than the private one, which influenced some parents' decision to use a private provider. Next slide, please. And what are the impacts of managing childcare? So from a gender equality perspective, it is worth noting that 55% of respondents told us that the costs of childcare had an impact on the work that they can do, while 66% said that it had an impact on their financial well-being. And this explains other issues such as the gender pay gap or the fact that women are more vulnerable to any economic shocks, etc. And in addition, 61% of women told us that managing childcare has impacted on their mental health, while 48% stated that managing childcare costs has influenced their decision not to have another child. This, as we know, brings its own challenges, with Scotland's population growing at the lowest rate compared to the other UK nations, according to the latest census data. Next slide, please. And regarding the economic impacts of childcare costs on women, almost 33% of respondents told us that they had to reduce their working hours to be able to manage these costs, while only 8% of respondents told us that their partners had to reduce their hours. In addition, almost 21% of women told us that they were using compressed hours arranged informally with their employer to manage childcare, and this figure was almost 15% for their partners. So again, this highlights the extent to which the lack of social infrastructure, i.e. affordable and accessible childcare, penalizes women, contributing to gender inequality. The next slide, please, shows some quotes that reflect the personal impacts of childcare costs on women. Lack of nursery availability meant I had to delay going back to work after maternity leave for longer than was planning. I had a much higher paid job previously, but the hours were not suitable. Now work in a call center, with better hours but less pay. We consider not having a second child, and I am very anxious as we have decided to have a second, but don't know how childcare is going to work. Irrespective of relationship difficulties, I cannot afford to leave my relationship. These quotes reflect the difficulties that women go through and the price that they pay when they become mothers. Next slide, please, Eve. So considering everything that we have discussed and what women told us, we made the following recommendations as part of our childcare briefing. So first of all, introduce the 30-hour funding with immediate effect after maternity leave. Women in our survey pointed out that this will help to keep their careers, and we also think that it would be a good measure, particularly with the cost of living crisis. Number two, it is important to ensure provision for those groups experiencing poverty. I haven't touched on this, but single parents and disabled women are the groups that are struggling the most. So again, as a way to help these households, it would be important to extend provision. Number three, extend funding beyond school term. So again, the 30 hours. Some parents drew attention to the fact that the 30 hours only cover school term, and so if you want to use them during the summer holiday, for example, then this comes at like 21 hours or 22 a week. But it's obviously had an impact on the finances and the way parents plan their finances. Next, recommendation is to review current implementation of early learning and childcare funding to ensure flexible childcare services for under 5 years old. Work with childcare providers in both urban and rural areas to improve accessibility. Develop affordable wraparound care for over 5 years old, because even though the fees are very expensive for 1 and 2 years old, once the school starts, given the time, the 9 until 3 hours at the school, parents struggle as well with wraparound care before and after school to be able to work. And finally, we recommended that it's important to recognize the extra costs of disabled children when designing childcare policies, services, and funding. Next slide, please. So we have reached the end of my presentation, but before I finish, I wanted to bring up this quote, which shows the extent of the problem and give us an idea of how much worse it can get. The quote goes, "We have worked hard throughout our adult lives, and we are both professionals with decent salaries, and we are still in a financially precarious position because of childcare and the astronomical rise in cost of living. There is no government relief or support for people in our position, and I understand why support needs to go to people who are less well off. But we are struggling too, to the edge of our resources. I'm dreading our mortgage renewal at the end of the year. I feel like the current system punishes me for going back to work. Nearly all of my salary goes on covering childcare costs, which obviously I could avoid by not returning to work, but then we couldn't pay our mortgage." So according to figures from UK Finance, about 800,000 fixed mortgages have expired since June. And there is another further 1.6 million or 1.7 coming to an end in 2024. These will result in sharp mortgages increases for homeowners and will also have a knock-on effect on renters as landlords will pass on the costs, etc. And with inflation still sitting at around 5%, it's unlikely that we'll see interest rates coming down anytime soon, squeezing people's incomes. So the need for strong public services and for tackling childcare costs is therefore key if we are to support families, and women in particular, during the cost of living crisis in Scotland. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. That was the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. Eve's email address is on the screen. Eve, over to you now.
Thank you, Carmen. I think we can all agree that it was really important to hear these experiences, and I'm sure some of you share these experiences too, of women with stark economic and personal impacts due to our current childcare system. So now I'm going to move on to Carole Erskine. I will quickly get her slides first before I begin. So Carole Erskine is the head of policy and campaigns for Pregnant and Screwed in Scotland. So Pregnant and Screwed, if you haven't heard of them already, are a charity and grassroots organisation that exists to end the motherhood penalty. So prior to this role, Carole was a journalist and TV reporter for almost 20 years, working at BBC Scotland, STV, Sky News and the Press Association. Carole was a political reporter during the 2014 independence referendum and continued to cover politics and general news once she returned from maternity leave. Carole has also worked at the John Smith Centre at Glasgow University, a research centre that exists to make the positive case for politics and public service. Over to you, Carole.
Thanks, Steve, very much. Thank you everyone for joining the call. I joined Pregnant Then Screwed in the summer, and I am working on the devolved issues around the motherhood penalty in Scotland. The organisation was funded by Julie Brearley, our CEO, and if we go to the next slide, she has made a video all about the motherhood penalty and what it means.
Now then, children, are you sitting comfortably? Then we'll begin.
Sorry.
Once upon a time, there was a talented and ambitious woman who had spent years working so very, very hard to achieve all of her career dreams. Until one day she met a handsome prince, and they decided they would like to start a family. She believed they would live happily ever after, with both of them able to achieve their dreams whilst giving their children all the love and care that they could muster. But when the woman became a mummy, she quickly realised that the whole system was set up to totally screw her.
In the 21st century, women are still being discriminated against simply for becoming pregnant.
Up to 1 in 10 women are finding no option but to leave work.
A survey by Pregnant Then Screwed shows that 71% of women trying to return to work cannot because of childcare.
They demoted me when I came back from maternity. I've been well and truly screwed.
There can be no shying away from this issue.
So can the Minister set out exactly what he's going to do to protect and defend those women from redundancy and discrimination in the workplace?
We are hearing from frantic mothers who are completely burnt out and their mental health is rapidly deteriorating.
And that, children, is why us mothers have had enough.
That was Jolie there who founded the charity. She did so in 2015. She was sacked from her job when she told them she was 4 months pregnant, sacked via voicemail. And she considered taking legal action, but discovered she was having a high-risk pregnancy and she could go into labour at any moment. So Mother's Day, International Women's Day, in 2015, she launched Pregnant Then Screwed, and it was initially a space for mothers to share their stories of discrimination. It's quickly grown. It's now a charity dedicated to ending the motherhood penalty. And we have two very distinct strands. We have a support service that we run where women or their partners or family can call or email and get support for discrimination in the workplace. We offer mentoring, we offer benefits advice. We offer a range of different support services there. And then the other side is campaigning. So up till now, all of the rest of the team are campaigning in England with Reserve Matters, obviously Impact Scotland, but now with my role, I'm looking at what's devolved in Scotland and the work that we can do up here. Next slide, please, Eve. So earlier this year, we did our own survey and we pulled out some Scottish results. And sorry, I beg your pardon, I've jumped away ahead of myself. So when I talk about what we mean by the motherhood penalty, it's probably important to just look at some specific stats around that. So in 2015, the Equality and Human Rights Commission released a report on pregnancy and maternity discrimination. It found that 77% of working mums encounter negative or discriminatory treatment in the workplace. Next slide, please, Eve. And only 1% of those women that experience that discrimination raise a tribunal claim. So that's many thousands that are not taking any action around that. Next slide, please. And 54,000 women a year lose their job for having a child. So that's 54,000 women being pushed out of their job every year, 1 woman every 10 minutes in the UK. Obviously, it's been a number of years since that report was produced, a number of which we've had in a pandemic, and that's only seen inequalities widen and forced vast amounts of women into unpaid and low-paid care work. Next slide, please, Eve. And we know that mothers are also struggling because of indirect discrimination, being reliant on the UK being one of the world's most expensive childcare systems. We actually have the second most expensive childcare system in the world. Next slide, please. So we did our own survey earlier this year across the UK, and we were able to pull out Scottish statistics, which will echo much of what Carmen's already touched on. So we had over 1,100 respondents to our survey, and all of those had at least one child who was under 5 years of age. So we found that almost 2/3 of those who responded are leaving the workforce or reducing their hours due to the cost and availability of childcare. Next slide, please. And 43% of Scottish parents that have seen costs increase in their childcare setting in the last 10 months said to us that they couldn't afford to have any more children as a result of childcare costs and the cost of living pressures today. Next slide, please, Eve. And the impact is really hitting parents from the get-go. So 65% of mothers that responded to the survey who have a child under 12 months say they have already or will have to cut their maternity leave short due to the cost of living pressures. 1 in 5 of these mothers are only able to take 6 months off of their planned leave. And for 1 in 10 mothers, they will have to return to work in less than 4 months after their child was born. Next slide, please, Eve. So a lot of the work that we are doing, particularly my colleagues in England, are looking at the general election and what that might mean when that comes round. So a big part of this is campaigning around paternity leave. So our call in the general election will be to have paternity leave paid at 90% of salary for 6 weeks. We know that countries with more than 6 weeks of paid paternity leave have a 4% smaller gender wage gap and 3.7% smaller labour force participation gap. So we know that closing the gender employment gap has a big input on the economy, and it would increase economic output by £23 billion. We know that dads want to have more leave. We know that what they get paid when they're on paternity leave is a big issue. So that is something we're doing a lot of work in and will continue to campaign ahead of a general election. Next slide, please, Eve. So in terms of what's happening in Scotland, right now as an organisation, we have launched our State of the Nation survey. So this is an annual survey we do every year with an organisation called Women in Data. I'll post a link to it in the chat when I'm finished, but I'd very much love as many of you as possible to fill this in and get a much wider picture. It goes beyond childcare. It looks at pregnancy discrimination. It looks at flexible working. It looks whether or not you're getting the support you need in your school. It looks at a much wider area. And what we're able to do when we get the results from that is break that down across Scotland and get a much clearer picture of what's going on by local authorities. So that's a big piece of work for us just now. And next year we will be doing a lot of campaigning work around what those figures show us. We're also acutely aware, as many will be, that we get the budget in the Scottish Parliament next week. We are interested to see what that's going to mean. We're aware that some early learning and childcare has been cut. Budgets have been cut across Scotland in different areas. We are aware of nurseries run by councils that are reducing hours or looking to charge more. We know there's a huge impact, and we'll hear from Jonathan about the impact on private nurseries, but we are very much aware of what councils' budgets will be looking like when they start to set them after the new year, and we're going to start campaigning around trying to ensure that the early learning and childcare budget, a part of that, isn't impacted, because we know what impact that will have on parents if all of a sudden nurseries start to change their hours or the costs go up or they can't get places. It's already so hard to get a place. It doesn't need to be made any worse than it already is. And we also have a new concept that we will be trying in Scotland called Pregnant Then Brood. So this is a campaign toolkit that we're looking to develop to work with parents when they may get that awful news that their nursery setting is closing or changing hours or reducing the number of places. So that is something that we'll be working on as well. Next slide, please, Eve. And then lastly, we've got our Pregnant Then Screwed Instagram page on Scotland. I would encourage as many of you as possible to follow that if you're on Instagram. That's where we're posting the work that we're doing, our updates, and anything that we want you to get involved in will be posted there. And that's it from me.
The first part was about... Perfect. Thank you very much. Just a reminder, if you could keep yourself on mute, that'd be great. And thanks, Carole. Great just to echoing the experiences that Carmen covered as well. A very inspiring organisation. Whenever I watch that video, always gets me fired up. And I'm really glad that Pregnant and Screwed are focusing work in Scotland now. So now we're going to move on to Jonathan Broadbury, the Director of Policy and Communications for the National Day Nurseries Association. So Jonathan is responsible for NDNA's policy and press work within England, Scotland and Wales. He works with NDNA members and strategic government contacts, policy advisors and the media to promote policies which support quality early years education and care. With a background in national and local government, he has experience in delivering real change through lobbying, engagement and media work. His role is responsible for supporting NDNA's national policy committees, as well as managing the work of NDNA Scotland and NDNA Cymru. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Eve. Thanks for that introduction as well. And I noted from that quote from Charlotte Whitton as well that apparently I only have to do half as well as some of the other panelists today, but I'll strive to do much better than that. Just a very brief introduction to NDNA, National Day Nurseries Association. We are a representative body for private and voluntary day nurseries that are involved in delivering childcare, whether that is parent-paid early learning and childcare for those younger children and babies when people go back to work, or through to government-funded ELC policies, as we see in Scotland with the 1140 hours. So we've got members from across Scotland who come together. We provide sort of advice and training, but as the introduction says, we also do engagement on what policy should look like to help those providers do what they do best, which is deliver the best quality learning opportunities for the young children that they care for, whilst also providing the essential childcare that working families need. Right, I'm just going to share my presentation now, and hopefully this works. Hopefully someone will pop up and tell me if it's not displaying. So obviously the title of today's event is What's Wrong with Childcare in Scotland. I want to start with a little bit talking about what's right, because we need to come from a place of recognizing where Scotland sits in terms of some of the other UK nations, as well as what's working well, so that we can move towards ideas that help to make things better. So looking at the 1140 hours policy, which was rolled out 2020-2021, slightly delayed due to the COVID pandemic, but in a lot of local authority areas, providers and local authorities were ready to roll that out anyway. So it did go ahead, albeit interrupted by the pandemic. And I think what works, or what is good to highlight about it, is the ambition that exists there. So that being a commitment not just to increasing the amount of childcare available to working families, but also that should be high quality as well, so that actually it's not just about parents getting back to work, but also about the outcomes that children get from having that access to high quality ELC. And it's when we're talking about funded childcare in terms of a gendered approach, it's got two elements. One being that it supports predominantly women back into the workforce, but also when we look at the ELC workforce in Scotland, it is over 95%, somewhere around 97%. Female as well, so there is an aspect that it is mainly a female-driven workforce. So things that impact on the sustainability of those employers impact largely on women, both from the delivery point of view, but also the employment point of view. And when we come to the principles as well of 1140 hours, this idea that it should be affordable and accessible to families, that there should be parental choice, but also provide a neutrality, so that actually if a family really like a private nursery down the road that works for them, or a setting that's closer to work, that they should have that choice, and it should be deliverable by anybody. We'll come on to whether or not that's the case in a little bit, but as a principle it works well, as does the idea that funding follows a child, so that when a parent takes up a place, they know that the support for their child will be resourced equally. So these principles and these ambitions for the policy are really admirable, and a lot of providers were really supportive of the policy as it was developed and rolled out. But what we'll come on to talk about is actually the practicalities for our members and other types of providers that have made life very, very difficult. I've mentioned the fact that it's early learning and childcare in Scotland, so there is that focus on the educational element. It's not just seen as oh, it's somewhere to put a child and pick them up at the end of the day. Actually, there's recognition through statutory guidance, like realizing the ambition, that actually really, really important development happens in those early years. And a good quality setting can be absolutely instrumental in shaping a child's lifelong learning journey, and that is absolutely crucial. The fact that it's a universal offer when it comes to 1140, so it's not tied to work as it is in some other parts of the UK, and there is high take up, 97% when you're talking about 3 to 5 year olds, and it's into the I think around 86% even for the funded 2-year-olds, which traditionally is a little bit more difficult to get engagement with from families. So there is high take up, and when the Scottish Government surveyed parents, again there was quite a high degree of satisfaction with the offer that was available to parents. We'll break that down in a little bit as well. But the other thing that's crucial to note for Scotland is, again, the child rights focus. So the Scottish Parliament's just passed the UNCRC Incorporation Bill, so that will enshrine in law this child-focused approach. Now, a lot of settings are already following that. It's embedded into early years practice, but actually putting that into legislation will, really make that a concrete consideration for every aspect of policy in this area. So, again, that's just covering off what's working well before I go further and start to talk about the problems and how we start to think about fixing those. So hopefully the next slide has come up. This is moving more on topic onto what's wrong with childcare in Scotland. And we've talked about a funded 1140 hours approach. I think a few people have mentioned in the chat that talking about it in terms of 30 hours doesn't always make sense because it's spread. Those 30 hours are only if you take them in term time. Once you spread 1140 hours over the course of a full year, it looks more like 22 and a bit hours a week. Now, for a lot of working families, that's not enough. Even if you're working part-time and you're thinking about pick-up, drop-off, and all the time involved, it's not necessarily this kind of full-time offer. And the other point to make is, whilst the offer is made to parents that these places are free, the offer isn't always to providers a rate that will cover all of their costs. We talk about sustainable rates, and I'll go into those in a little more detail in a couple of slides. But the fundamental challenge for providers is, just as families are facing a cost of living crisis, they have also faced a cost of operating crisis. Salaries have gone up, 10% year on year at least, and that's just for the minimum salaries. And we're talking about a system that wants to really focus on quality, to then pay the more experienced and more qualified staff above the minimum rate is putting more and more pressure on providers. And we know that when the minimum rates go up by about 10%, the overall wage bill for providers needs to go up by at least 14-15%, just to maintain those differentials. And that is really important. And we've got a point coming up about the workforce crisis that the sector is facing as well. But then those take-up rates that I quoted in the previous slide don't tell a full picture. So we know that actually for 3 to 5 year olds, full take-up is only about 73%. And when that comes to 2 year olds, it drops to about 54%. So just because they're in parents are entitled to a full 1140 hours doesn't mean to say they're taking that up, and that could be lack of flexibility, and we know that's the main reason, that parents aren't getting the desired sessions that they want, either in the setting or at the times that they need for work. As we've heard already, that has a knock-on effect of parents, and predominantly women, not being able to work the hours that they want, and that can mean that they're not necessarily working the job that they want. They might be trained in a certain field, but say, do you know what, for these years I have to work outside of my area of experience, and because I can get part-time hours that suit and work around my childcare commitments. So that's bad for the parents, it's bad for the career, it's bad for the economy. There's also a consideration here of if a parent is bringing up a child in a frustrated household where they've not got the income that they maybe could earn, or not doing a job that they love, and what kind of an environment is that for the child growing up as well? So it's not just the economic aspect there. And then I've made a point there about differential funding, and this is really important. This is the difference between the proportion of places that a council and the Scottish Government, by extension, buys from either a private, a voluntary, in an independent setting, or a childminder, and the rates that setting can expect to receive, compared with the cost of delivering those places in the council's own settings. I've got a bit more data on that to come up, but basically about 30% of the funded hours are being delivered by private and voluntary nurseries, but that proportion of the funding is not being paid for that. So whilst, again, a provider has to demonstrate their financial sustainability to be able to enter into an agreement with the local authority, so when as a parent you might choose a nursery, it may not be possible for your child to get funded place in that nursery, and certainly not with a childminder, and so that choice is cut off by these kinds of problems. I've mentioned about a recruitment and retention crisis. That a lot of our members are saying the number one issue for them is having the number of staff that they need at the qualification levels that they need them to be able to offer those places. So they might have a waiting list precisely because they can't staff the rooms to the level that they need to be able to offer more places to more children and families. And this is tied to the first point about funding, because if a provider isn't funded enough to cover their costs and to cover their staffing costs, staff can often leave to find better paid work with fewer responsibilities in other sectors like retail, the other thing that we've seen is, because local authority provision has grown significantly, and it's grown by about 60%, the local authority workforce since 2016, a lot of that recruitment is taken from private and voluntary settings, so that the staff are now working in the public sector. And for private and voluntary nurseries, the staff turnover is now 29%, and that's data from the Scottish Social Services Council. And what that means is that experienced, qualified staff are leaving private nurseries, voluntary run nurseries, to take up posts, like say a small proportion outside the early learning and childcare sector, but a vast majority into council run settings. And that has an impact. When you have that high turnover, it's expensive for providers when they come to recruit and train staff, but it's also having a knock-on effect on the degree of quality that they can maintain, because you're having to constantly refresh your staff on policies and approaches, making sure they're getting up to qualification levels. And what providers tell us is, I train my staff up and then they leave to work somewhere else. I've got to start again at square one. So what's next for childcare in Scotland? We've already had some of the announcements in the programme for government in September. Obviously, this session precedes the budget announcements as well, and it'd be really important to see what's happening with the investment there, because this is a priority area. But the Scottish Government's got plans to accelerate the expansion to 2-year-olds. We know from the last election there was a commitment to go further and look at children around 1 and potentially under. And we also know that the SNP is looking at extending the length of early years so that P1 is actually counted as part of the early years, and children don't start school until 6. So there's expansion possibilities at both ends, because again, data from European counterparts show that some of that focus on learning through play in early years can have longer term beneficial impacts. We know that there was an announcement that to recognise the challenges that PVI providers have in paying more because of funding rate challenges to their staff, that more funding was going to be put in to increase staff pay to £12 an hour in the PVI sector. Sorry, that's private, voluntary and independent nursery sector. But that has been surpassed by the real living wage announcement, which is going to £12 an hour. And to be able to offer the funded places, a provider nursery has to commit to pay that real living wage. Now, what we know happens is providers have a difficult choice, because only about half of their income comes from the funded places. So do they put half of their staff on the real living wage and the other half at a different pay structure, or do they pay everybody the same and have that? Again, this is a gendered issue given the status of the workforce, but that has to come out of cost increases to parents, because it's not the Scottish Government funding that is paying for that. So where we've got the statistics going up for parents, we know that for providers, their costs are going up by more than what is being passed on to parents, because they're working hard to either keep their costs down in other areas, or a lot are operating at a loss or just breaking even, and that is not good for the long-term sustainability of the sector. I'll just touch briefly on the final point there about childminders, because whilst they're talking about, again, recruiting 1,000 extra childminders, we know that not all childminders from the Scottish Childminder Association's audit, not all childminders are able to work with local authorities on delivering some of these funded hours. And going back to the point about parental choice, we know that for a lot of people, a blended approach where pickups and drop-offs with a childminder, or a child might spend part of their time with a childminder, part of their time with a nursery, are actually quite challenging to work under the funded model. So again, some local authorities do well on this. In other areas, it's just not possible. So for parental choice, again, it's not always ideal. And then, so the provider experience of funding rates. So this is really important. So essentially, to break it down, the Scottish Government is promising every parent a Mars bar, but that Mars bar costs something different in every different part of the country. And essentially, a shop might be being asked to provide a Mars bar at 25p when a Mars bar costs them 50p, and that is what's happening with funding rates. We do a lot of work looking at what is happening with funding rates from the local authorities to providers, and a lot of that is driven by the budget that local authorities get. We understand that, but the reality is, if providers don't get a rate that is actually sustainable, then they are not going to be able to remain open. They're not going to be able to offer places to parents. And on the flip side of it, parents, who have to, buy additional hours, or parents of younger children that are currently paying fees, face higher costs to make sure that that setting is sustainable. And at a time when the Scottish Government own research found that provider costs were going up by 14% a year, the rates of increases from local authorities in the sustainable rate that they're paying for the hour of childcare being delivered, where there were increases went from 1.4 to 15.5%, and only 2 local authorities were actually delivering a rate increase that was more than the 14% increase in costs that providers were seeing. And that's 18 local authorities where the rates were going up. In some areas, they came back to tell us that, yes, term starts next week, but we haven't made a decision yet on what providers are going to be paid. And in other areas, the rates had simply stayed the same, because the local authority said there wasn't the budget to increase the funding rates. So essentially, again, you come back to that relationship. The providers are being asked to deliver a service on behalf of Scottish Government via the local authorities, and are being told that you're not going to find out until 3 months into delivering that contract what you're actually going to be paid for doing that. So that, from a planning point of view, isn't sustainable. And then from rates not going up by the same rate as costs, also not sustainable. And then just to touch on that point about differential rates again, we asked councils what percentage of your funded ELC is delivered through partner providers. And we know nationally it's about 31%. And what is the budget? What proportion of your ELC budget do you put towards essentially buying those hours? And again, across Scotland, the average was 28.3% of hours bought. But in terms of budget allocation, it was 22.8. So there is a gap there. And some local authorities, the gap was positive, but the vast majority, it was negative. So they were getting more hours than they were allocating budget for. And I come back to that idea of the principles, because what we see is the principle of things like provider neutrality and funding follows the child doesn't come through in reality, which means for parents, if you choose your local nursery and it's a private one, then the resources available to that nursery might not be the same as the resources available per child in another neighbouring nursery. So we think that there's a challenge there that needs to be looked at. So what do we need to see? First point is genuinely sustainable rates. So the investment actually needs to keep pace with rising costs, and this can only be done with a genuine annual review. We know that in some areas that might happen once every 3 years or every 2 years, but the last 2 years have shown energy bills up 2, 3, 4 times as much as they were before. So everything, food getting much more expensive. People can't wait, and at the same time, where a provider has to demonstrate their sustainability but doesn't know what their income is going to be, it's an impossible catch-22 situation for them. So we need genuinely sustainable rates that will address low pay, that will help address the pay differentials between what's available to private sector workers, voluntary sector workers, compared to what's available in local authorities. And then, as I say, annual reviews of that. But we need to grow the early years workforce. If we're talking about expanding the offer, the whole aim of that presumably would be get more children into childcare places so that more parents can work. That's the only way that this policy, makes sense economically. So we've got programs that get people out of unemployment and into working in the ELC workforce. And we'd love to see more initiatives that could work like that across Scotland. And then a long-term campaign for us has been a single parent account, because we know that part of the low take-up is parents not knowing what they're eligible for. Once you throw in universal credit, once you throw in tax-free childcare, there's an ever-shrinking number of people on legacy benefits, but it's complicated. You have to resubmit things monthly. You have to re-register quarterly. We know that people drop off the system, and on the flip side of it, for providers, it's very complicated when it comes to submitting data, when it comes to checking registers. We think that can all be simplified with a single account, where whatever you're eligible for through whatever scheme it is, that comes into one place and can be then used to pay one or two or even three childcare providers of the parents' choosing. So that genuinely gives parental choice. It genuinely ensures funding follows the child, and we think, again, it means that more time for those providers to spend with children rather than on the admin side of things. And if we don't, what happens? Well, we've already seen a report just come out today about over 100 nurseries closing since 2021, over 347 childminders leaving the sector recently. We know that the vast majority of the closures are driven by financial situations, but we also know that some nurseries, because of the workforce crisis that I mentioned, they simply can't recruit the managers or the deputy managers that they need to legally open. So even though there's demand, even though there's parents who want to use that service closes because there's just not the staff who can operate it. Fewer services means less parental choice. That means maybe you've got farther to go for services that that are out of your way for work, thus again impacting on parents' abilities to work. And one thing that I also want to mention here, and apologies, I should have mentioned it earlier, is the knock-on effect for those children with additional support needs. So we know one of the factors about that parental choice is where they can take up those places, where funding is available to support those children, because it might be that they need extra one-to-one support, but if the nursery in question is told, well, you're only going to get the basic funding that they're entitled to, then there's no capacity to have one-to-one support when that adult would normally be working with 4 or 5 children, and that's how the funding is calculated. I'm sure we'll hear more about the economic impact in terms of poverty where people can't work, so I won't go into that. But I will just come back to that point about the poorer outcomes for children, because it's not just what happens to that child until they're 5. There is a myriad of research out there that shows that the learning experiences children have access to up to the age of 5 stays with them all the way through primary school into secondary school, that it takes them up to 16. So I think the Education Policy Institute reviewed some evidence that showed that 40% of the attainment gap between children from more disadvantaged backgrounds and their peers, 40% of that gap that exists at 16 is already evident age 5, and if you've not addressed it by then, it just gets worse. It's much more difficult to take it back. So that's that greater impact on the disadvantage. And we hear from the Scottish Government that one of their key drivers is addressing that poverty gap, both through parents working, but also in the long term through children's outcomes. So we want to see investment that really delivers high quality. And I will leave you on one final thought about why it's important that we do this now, which is very famous economist James Heckman. I've put the link in if you want to find out more, but it just shows that the earlier you invest in children, the bigger the impact it has on their life chances. So once you get to post-school age, you have to it's not to say that you can never change things, but because that foundational difference hasn't been made, you've got so much more that you need to do in the later stages in life. So I will stop sharing now, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was all really interesting, especially highlighting on the delivery, employment and recruitment and providers' point of view, and that Heckman curve was really interesting. So we're now going to move over to Jack Evans. I think he's just trying to sort of screen share. He is a senior policy advisor at the Joseph Brown Foundation. Jack leads JRF's work on the relationship between poverty and the labour market in Scotland. And before joining JRF, Jack spent 5 years at the Poverty Alliance as the Living Wage Scotland manager, working with employers from all sectors and industries to help embed the real living wage in wage structures. Prior to entering the third sector in 2015, Jack was operations manager of H&M in Scotland, and before that worked at the UK anti-doping. So over to you, Jack.
Thank you. And can you just let me know, can you see my notes or just the slides?
No, just the slides. Perfect.
That's good, because they are pretty illegible and would be embarrassing for people to see them. So thanks so much for having me along today. Everything that has gone before, I think, has been very interesting and fantastic. I'm going to focus talking about work that we are doing for preschool childcare as an effective tool to reduce poverty. So we're talking ELC, and I'm going to give you a focus, an overview of our current work that's underway at the moment, not yet published, but some insights from that. I want to outline ELC policy aims. I want to give the necessary context of the labour market, and to kind of show what parents are kind of telling us and what the prize might be with a different ELC offer. So many will know this, but just to be clear, when we're talking about ELC, the Scottish Government have kind of these three big strategic policy aims: poverty prevention, closing the attainment gap, which was touched on earlier; poverty reduction by removing barriers to jobs and training; and increased family resilience, so better health and well-being outcomes. I've highlighted the one in yellow that we're going to be talking about this afternoon, and that is our focus. So overall in JRF in Scotland, we are interested in this because we are firstly interested in the child poverty and in child poverty targets. In previous publications, we have said that we are off track and that we need every lever getting pulled to reach the child poverty targets of less than 10% of children in relative poverty by 2030. Childcare and ELC fits under this. The big spend from the 1140 offer is put into the child poverty budget. We know and we've heard about the big take-up in that offer, but we're as yet unsure of the impact. Implementation has been rightly praised of this offer, and doubling the offer of funded childcare for this group at 1140 is a huge undertaking. But the assessment of that impact has not moved quite as fast as the stated political ambition to extend the offer. So there's a risk that with a very expensive policy getting extended further without evidence base, which is something we need to all look out for in the budget. So the ongoing project that we're looking at, the relationship between work and ELC, is kind of signified or highlighted in this kind of diagram on the side. So we've conducted a literature review. We've polled families, and I noted with interest some questions about methodology. So the polling has been done With a nationally represented survey, we can break it down by many things, including the age of child, the age of youngest child, gender, ethnicity, and whether people are in a priority family or not. We're then in a phase at the moment of public consultation and sector consultation about the findings, and we're trying to mould these findings into a number of prospective childcare offers for ELC, and then model that against what the impact would be on reduction of child poverty. So a pause and a bit of a health warning first, because when I sometimes talk about this, I can sound a little bit like Rihanna, and it's all about work, work, work. But it's really important to kind of just note at this point that we appreciate that this is just part of the story. Parents place huge value on their childcare and have a great admiration for the work that goes into looking after their kids, making sure their well-being is intact every day when they go into their childcare settings. And it's an important feature of society, not just an economic tool to increase growth. We also risk ignoring major inequalities in unpaid work that have been highlighted by Carole earlier, and also that the deep connection between the three stated strategic policy aims of ELC can sometimes be in tension with each other, but there's a great prize to making sure all three work together. And the last point, which was highlighted excellently earlier by Jonathan, was that workforce and provider issues must be part of any analysis of ELC. We're not designing fantasy policy. We are not operating in a vacuum. These things need to work in the real world. So that is constantly within our minds. So with that said, going back to ELC and work, there's a couple of things that are vital for context. So I wanted to highlight a couple of things going on in our labour market that are intrinsically linked to this conversation. So when I talk about work intensity, and work intensity is nothing to do with the type of work that you do, it's to do with the number of hours that people do. And I'd like to highlight two bits on this chart, the orange line and the green line. What this tells us is that parents are working more than ever. For children under 5 in their households, the most common work setup is both parents in full-time work. And the shrinking and the fastest shrinking situation at work is a workless household. So parents are working more than ever, and they're working greater hours than ever. This is the view across the whole population in Scotland. But when we look at it for families in poverty, which is where JRF's interests are trained, we see almost a complete reversal of that trend, these trends. So the orange bars represent the general population, and the blue bars represent those in poverty. So while the general population sees both parents in work as the most common setup, the most common setup for families in poverty are one full-time working and one not working. It's unsurprising that this setup is deeply gendered, with 93% of women in families where one parent is full-time, and they are the person that are not in work, and it's the man that is in work. The reason we want to highlight this, or I'm interested in highlighting this, is that policies aimed at ensuring people go into work via an additional ELC offer cannot ignore the fact, the deeply unjust situation that we have within the labour market in terms of gender inequality in pay. A good example of this is persistent low pay. So this chart shows over a 5-year period where people fluctuate in terms of their earnings, and more importantly, where they don't fluctuate and stay the same. So the bottom pink bit shows 1 in 10 workers are trapped in low pay for 5 years. So those are people who have started work paid below the living wage and end work or end that 5-year period in low pay. So of those 1 in 10 who are in persistent low pay, 7 out of 10, so 72% odd, of persistent low pay are women. So the idea of just having an ELC offer that moves parents into work, and in terms of prevention poverty targeted at women, moving people into work, must ensure that you're not going into low pay and that jobs are paid at least at the real living wage. Otherwise, we're exacerbating the problem of in-work poverty and compounding existing labour market inequalities. Much of that work to ensure that people move into good work is not to do with childcare, but there is obviously a large element of good changes that could be made to the ELC offer that would enable parents to find better work, and we will look at some of that in a second. But firstly, the literature review that we conducted was motivated by two things. Firstly, that there's a great deal of research that has gone before about this topic, and that we wanted to find a way to represent all the recommendations that have gone before and analyse them. So across the about 30 relevant publications that were in scope of the literature review conducted by the DIFLI Partnership, we have included about 47 recommendations, and they range over a number of issues, but all kind of related to the interaction between paid work and ELC. Some of the most important ones are about data collection and how data is used, but also about parents lacking in choice, and changes to the way that the childcare market is run in terms of profitability and the privatisation or financialisation of childcare. We also see great demand for increased places, and an interaction with child benefit and alternate payment models also highlighted. The research from the literature review found quite large gaps in terms of what hasn't been properly evaluated, one of which is the variation in delivery and strategy between local authorities. I don't think there's 32 different strategies on how the 1140 hour has been implemented, but there's clearly some degree of variation, and we need to know what works and what doesn't so that others can copy best practice and reduce bad practice. The last part is something that is ran through all of our work on this, is about contradictory findings. At high level statistics, when we look at population satisfaction with ELC offers, we find generally favourable to positive results. People are quite happy with their flexibility, they're quite happy with the quality, and they're quite happy what their child gets out of it. However, when we break that down further into qualitative research in the focus groups with parents on low incomes and parents within the priority families, we find this is not the experience. So the polling that we've commissioned and that has been, which has happened and we're just currently analysing, has a couple of interesting findings that I'd like to highlight. So firstly, the existing policy offer kind of matches what parents want from their childcare. What parents want from a new offer is not crazily different from the existing offer. And an extended offer, which they have chosen, interacts quite interestingly with the world of paid work. Yet there's unsurprisingly important variables within that. So just to delve into the first couple of those. Again, all this polling will be broken down by age of child and age of and whether or not people are within poverty or not. But you can see here we've done it by low income, all, and not low income. So these are people that have been offered. This data represents people that have been offered about 10 different choices about what their number one thing they like about their childcare at the existing offer. And what we see quite clearly is people think it's great for their children's social development, which is a good sign. We're pleased to see this. They think it's good for their language and development, and it clearly enables people to work or study. It's not acting as a platform for people to go out and look for work. And there's a couple of reasons for this and why the numbers might be low. Firstly, going back to the first context slide, parents are already in work. To some degree, the work aspect of ELC is already working for many. But also, we also know that people need additional resources and a whole bunch of other things to come together to enable them to look for work that is just not happening right now. So this is what they think of the current offer. And this is what they might want from a new offer. I've only chosen to take hours in this because there's obviously a lot more detail that can be provided about flexibility, situation, etc. But I think just to focus on the hours as that often gets reported. What we see here, the two bars represent the responding parents. So accepting there will be some slight variation, and there's a bit of a heterosexual couple bias here. Essentially, one is man, one is woman, and what we see is broadly people wanting the same thing, and they want somewhere between, the majority want somewhere between 35 and 40 hours per week. We've seen campaigns for much greater hours than this, and this reflects people working full time. But I think what's clear is that an offer much closer to 35 hours would be what parents are after at the moment. So what that offer would mean, so we know what they currently value, we know what they're looking for in terms of a new offer, and this is what they're telling us as their top 3 reasons for what they would gain from a better offer or this new offer. So again, the top one is about their family being better off, increased family resilience. And this, looking at the data, means that people would actually sometimes drop down in terms of the hours that they work. But overall, it's about their family well-being. Obviously, the part of the middle shows a big increase in this new offer, saying that they would work more. But again, this is not quite as straightforward as it sounds. This is not fully about people moving in to work from being workless. That is part of the story. It would allow people to increase their work from no to more hours. But it also, survey respondents told us that it would allow them to access better paid work. So this is often through the move from part-time to full-time, but we know it also means that people are looking to get into better work, to change the work circumstances by going for a better job that they might feel qualified for, or for to get a promotion that they feel requires more time to maintain. This means that the kind of old adage of, you know, childcare being allowing people to get into work is far too simplistic interpretation of what parents are actually experiencing. Parents are feeling that the current offer just allows them to tread water in their current positions, but for them to increase their kind of economic activity and to go further in their careers, they need a more secure, flexible surrounding for their child. And of course, a few more hours wouldn't go amiss either. So while we're still kind of interpreting the data, because there's a lot of data to come back, some of the kind of summaries of what we've seen so far, that interaction between childcare and increasing income are not straightforward. We know that ELC must, however people view ELC, it must include how we interpret the labour market. There's a prevalence of people to kind of segregate these different chunks of policy from employment support, childcare, labour market policy separately. They must be seen in the round and make the journey of someone going from in work to better work, out of work to work, part-time to full work, work for the family, and the support must be tailored around that. We also believe that changes to existing offers need to be targeted. We see quite a big variation, has been highlighted by others, between rural and urban-based parents. So we know, for example, that in terms of flexibility, you are twice as likely to be dissatisfied with flexibility if you're based in a rural setting. And the final point that's coming out from our early findings is that new funding models must be on the table. Parents are willing to pay a bit more either on top of their ELC funded offer, or to ensure that they get their children the care that they're looking for. While the universal offer has a significant number of benefits, with the current constraints on Scottish budget, I don't think we can rule out looking at how families in high income households are able to contribute more to their childcare, to ease the burden on the services, and also ensure that people on the lowest income get the most support. So the next steps for us in this work are to speak to as many people about the survey findings and the literature review as possible, to help create the scenarios that we are interested in modelling. We'll then run those modelling scenarios with the Fraser Allander Institute to see the impact of poverty, and then design policy proposals based on that are costed in terms of what could actually be done and how it might be paid for, which feels like an even more important task at the moment with the current budget settlement than ever before. So look forward to any questions, and thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you so much, Jack. That was really interesting, and thank you for this really important research.